Gather close, Shard walkers, and still your breath. In the grim darkness of the far future, even the light of hope gutters against an endless night. Something has emerged from the void without herald or warning. A harbinger of dread come to claim its due. Within its lightless hull, a soul named Luther Hale is drawn into nightmare, caught in an inescapable grasp. As always, your support is appreciated, not mandated. Should you wish to bolster this chronicle and fuel our cause, you will find the link in the archives below. Such patronage keeps the Astronomicon of our storytelling burning bright. But remember, contribution is by choice, never by decree. Now steel your soul, Shard Walker. An eerie silence settles over Luther Tertius. They came like a black omen in the night, an imperial vessel so vast and lightless that it seemed to devour the starlight around it, settled into the upper atmosphere of Luther Tertius with barely a whisper. Not a single lumen cut through its matte void hull, and no clarion rang out to herald its arrival. In the gloom of the planet's midnight, there was only a ripple in the clouds and a growing sense of dread that weighted every beating heart. Luther Hale stood outside the half-collapsed Hab Shrine, where he sometimes went for solace. He'd been compelled here by a wave of nausea and uncanny fear, as though the sky itself pressed down upon him. Wind hissed through the broken arches around him, stirring dust. He tried to breathe, but the air had turned thick and cold. He looked up. The moonlit darkness shimmered like oil on water. Flickers of movement, shapes that defied ordinary logic, suggested a colossal silhouette drifting overhead. Then a low-frequency hum set the ground trembling. The sensation burrowed through Luther's bones. His eyes watered, his skull pounded. It felt as if something immense had locked its eye upon him, an insect pinned beneath an invisible claw. He stumbled to his knees, pressing both hands to his temples. Had the blessed Emperor forsaken them? The planet had always been dusty, quiet, overshadowed by the local war for resources in the neighboring system. But not once in Luther's recollection had such a ship arrived in orbit without a parade of the planetary governor's officials lining up to greet it. No ceremony, no greeting, no bright running lights, just dread incarnate looming above. Though he knew next to nothing of starships beyond rumor, Luther recognized from the hush in the settlement that whatever had come was no ordinary visitor. Families huddled in locked habs. The scribes in the administratum block flicked their lights off to avoid any notice. The handful of local militia who dared to stir ventured out in formation, but a single glance upward left them uneasy, each uncertain which order to give or follow. Something snatched Luther's focus. He realized the ship was still descending, or at least drifting to a lower orbit, so close that the wind whipped up clouds of dust across the plaza. Abruptly, a shrill klaxon wailed in the distance, and across the city block he saw a plume of black smoke. He did not yet know it, but squads of heavily armed Imperial agents had landed. In that moment, a metallic taste filled Luther's mouth, and he reeled at the surge of panic pounding in his chest. He fought to keep breathing, to keep from retching. Every fiber in his being insisted, flee. Yet curiosity and fear held him fast. He was but a young man from the fields east of the city, a simple worker who'd come to the hive outskirts in hopes of more stable employment. He had only ever known the Emperor's distant grace as taught by the local preachers. No rumors, no stories had prepared him for an unnatural, star-swallowing craft. Luther managed to regain his footing, shivering in the chill that had nothing to do with the desert night's temperature. From somewhere far off, he heard terrified screams. Echoing roars of engines overhead pelted the skies with thunder. The black shape above pivoted fractionally, revealing faint glints of starlight on gargantuan turrets. Some primal fear rose in Luther's mind. Run. Run. With one trembling hand, he crossed the sign of the Aquila over his chest, praying to the Emperor. In that hush between heartbeats, something intangible and dreadful slid across his senses. He felt it more than heard it, a hush that devoured all else, a choking emptiness. He had no idea what was coming for him, but it was already too late. Luther Hale's eyes snapped open at the sound of boots pounding against the stone steps. The meltdown of fear he'd felt earlier still clung to his bones, leaving him shaky and weak. He hadn't even realized how he got back to his cramped habdorm, only that after the ominous ship had passed overhead, he'd stumbled home in a daze. He blinked at the rude glow of a flickering lumen in the corridor. It was still dark outside. Night had not yet given way to dawn. Figures moved with quick purpose beyond his door. Shouts punctuated the hallway in coarse, low Gothic. "Clear that room. Unseal this door. Now." Sweat beaded along Luther's brow. He had no notion of who they might be, only that their tone radiated authority and a ruthless edge. Another set of boots hammered against his door, rattling it on its hinges. "Open up or we break it down." Before he could even respond, the door swung inward, kicked with enough force to slam against the hab's far wall. He saw 4 uniformed men in black flak armor, each brandishing a shock maul, the arcs of disruptor fields crackling ominously across their weapon heads. Their eyes were hard, pupils contracted as though anticipating violence. "Identify yourself," the lead enforcer barked. I'm Luther Hale," he stammered. They advanced, weapons raised. Luther raised both hands, trembling. One of the men consulted a data slate. "Yes, that matches," he said, voice thick with disinterest. "Suspected deviance, unauthorized psychic activity reported in the last fortnight. He fits the profile." Luther reeled at the words. "Psychic activity? I don't know." But they seized him without hesitation. A heavy clamp pinned his arms. Another man forced a steel muzzle over his mouth. The shock maul crackled near his ribs, a silent threat to keep him still. He wanted to shout in protest, but only muffled whimpers escaped the muzzle. The enforcers spoke over him. "Target secured. Move." They hauled him into the corridor. The habdorm was in chaos. Doors had been smashed open. People in ragged clothes clutched one another, wide-eyed with terror. A child sobbed in a corner, comforted by a mother who was too terrified to speak. No one attempted to interfere. They all knew interference meant summary punishment, or worse. The men in black armor wore no insignia that Luther recognized, but that only amplified their aura of unstoppable authority. Within minutes, Luther was dragged outside. The night wind stung his bare arms, and he shivered in the open air. Close by, other squads were rounding up terrified citizens, most of them shrieking or delirious. In the glare of portable floodlights, Luther saw that some detainees were old men, others merely adolescents. All wore the same muzzle contraption, forced into silence. Beyond, in the main thoroughfare, a massive grav transport waited. A blocky hulk, painted a dull charcoal. It had no lights except for a single red lamp above the rear ramp. One by one, prisoners were marched inside, each with a pair of black-armored enforcers pressing shock mauls to their backs. Thunder rumbled overhead. Luther recalled the black silhouette above the clouds. Was this the same unstoppable presence, manifested now in flesh and blood? Something about that ship, some intangible dread, made him physically ill. They pushed him into the grav transport's hold, jammed against others so tightly he could smell their sweat and fear. The ramp sealed shut, plunging them into darkness, lit only by the red emergency glow. Then a voice from a distant loudhailer crackled. "All squads, final check and launch." The internal thrusters vibrated underfoot, and Luther realized they were being taken away. By whose authority, for what end, he did not know. He had never truly believed himself a psyker. He recalled strange dreams, fleeting illusions when he was a child, but chalked them up to imagination. Now these unknown captors were hauling him off as if he were a criminal. In that stifling hold, the thrusters roared, and the transport lurched into the air. Bodies swayed and tumbled. Muffled cries filled the cramped space. Luther tasted blood where the muzzle's metal pressed against his lips. He braced himself against the hull, panting through his nose. "Emperor, protect me," he prayed, though no words emerged from behind the muzzle. He felt confusion swirling in his mind. What is happening? Who are these men? Am I truly some kind of witch? That can't be. His prayer found no comfort. Instead, the emptiness that had haunted him outside the Hab shrine returned, creeping into his awareness. As they soared upwards, the air grew thicker with dread. He felt a wave of vertigo. It was as though a silent hand reached into his chest, plucking at a hidden thread in his soul. The feeling lingered as the transport pierced the night sky. In the dim red glow, he saw tears streaming from his fellow prisoners' eyes, wide with horror. Could they feel it too? A sense that something was devouring hope itself. No one could speak. The muzzle stifled every attempt. Luther could only cling to the hull's ridges as the transport climbed, and the whine of grav engines rattled the compartment. Slowly, the world outside the sealed ramp gave way to the star-filled night. Then came a deep metallic thunk, the sensation of docking. Clamps locked onto the craft, pulling it into a larger structure. In the sudden hush, the ramp hissed open. A choking rush of stale air enveloped them. Heavy boots thundered again. Then, a jolt of blind, primal terror shot through Luther's veins. A silhouette walked up the ramp, a tall female figure in gilded plate armor, her face obscured by a crested helm and a veil that left only the faint outline of aquiline features. She carried no visible firearms, only a slender blade at her hip. But it was her presence, an indescribable emptiness, that froze Luther's breath. The distant whispers in his mind, half-perceived anxieties, winked out like candles doused in black water. He felt his heart hammer in protest, as if it might stop altogether. The other prisoners quivered too. Some retched. Without a word, she surveyed them. Slowly, her gaze moved from prisoner to prisoner. Luther's eyes locked on her for a moment. An odd prickling suffused his scalp. He looked away, heart pounding. This was no ordinary guard. Something about her aura was thoroughly inhuman. Or more precisely, it felt like the absence of what made humans alive. "Begin processing," another voice commanded, belonging to one of the black-armored men. The silent woman stepped aside. Lines of troopers began pulling prisoners from the compartment. One by one, they were marched onto the corridors of a massive ship, shackled at wrists and ankles, muzzled and stripped of any personal belongings. Luther had never known such fear. He hardly noticed as they ripped his work clothes away, leaving him in a ragged undershirt and trousers. They affixed an iron collar around his neck. A chain linked that collar to the next prisoners. He glimpsed the tall female figure, a sister of silence, departing up a separate corridor. At the time, he had no idea what that title meant, only that she was one of many stepping across the deck plating in eerie quiet. No words, no sign of expression, just gliding phantoms of judgment. The corridor was lined with faintly pulsing glow strips. The walls were black, etched with words that Luther could not read. The air stank of machine oil and old blood. The deeper they led him into the labyrinth, the more cold and claustrophobic it became. Around him, half a dozen or so prisoners hobbled along in trembling silence. He saw the raw fear in their eyes. He felt it mirrored in himself. Where are we? Where are they taking us? No answers. Only footsteps echoing on metal deck plating, and the distant thrum of the ship's engines. At length, the corridor opened into a wide mustering bay. Rows upon rows of ragged captives in identical collars stood in line. Some wavered on their feet, as if drugged or delirious. Overhead, a vast catwalk teemed with more black-armored officers, each brandishing shock mauls or las carbines. Luther's group joined the line. Another captive, an older man who sported a nasty bruise along his temple, caught Luther's eye. He tried to speak, but the muzzle allowed only faint grunts. A guard's shout cut him off. "Still your tongues. Any attempt at communication is forbidden." Luther's heart hammered. In the gloom, the older man's expression crumpled in helpless fear. An officer stepped to the center of the bay. Beside him stood one of the silent women in gilded armor, arms folded across her chest. Beneath the flickering lumens, the officer, his face scarred, eyes sunken, addressed them in a tone that bristled with authority. "You wretches have been found wanting. You stand aboard one of the Emperor's black ships, where psykers and their ilk are collected for the good of mankind. Consider your new status a gift or a punishment. It matters not." Luther frowned behind the muzzle. He had never heard the term black ship, but the way the man spat it made it sound final, doom-laden. The officer continued, "You will be contained, tested, and judged. If you comply, your suffering shall be minimal. Resist, and the sisters shall show you no mercy. Either way, you are bound for terror, to face the Emperor's will." A hush claimed the bay, broken only by faint weeping, and so began the slow unspooling of Luther Hale's nightmare. Luther's first days aboard the Black Ship blurred into an unending cycle of sedation, delirium, and the suffocating press of human misery. He found himself transferred to a cramped cell, little more than a steel box with a single flickering lumen overhead. Cold shackles clamped his wrist to the wall. The muzzle remained locked over his mouth, preventing any attempt to speak or bite. The collar around his neck thrummed faintly with each labored heartbeat, occasionally giving off a punishing jolt if he moved too forcefully. At random intervals, meals or shifts or something else entirely, guards would appear to haul him out, half conscious and trembling, into long corridors that reeked of filth. Sometimes the guards forced him to stand in a line with other prisoners. Other times they moved him alone, escorted by that dreadful silence that poured off the sisters. The first time he saw a sister of silence up close, truly up close, his mind nearly shut down. She approached him in a narrow corridor, gold-trimmed armor reflecting the overhead lights, a featureless mask hiding her face. As she passed, he lost all sense of who he was or where. A suffocating emptiness overcame him, as if the luminous spark within his consciousness was snuffed out. When she was gone, the wretched spark returned, along with tears on his cheeks and an ache in his chest that refused to subside. He did not understand that his psychic potential, latent though it might be, recoiled from her blank aura. All he knew was an acute sense of being utterly alone in the universe. At one point, they dragged him to a strange chamber where robed attendants scanned him with arcane devices. Luther's mind swam with half-lost details. The droning hum of some psychic nullifier. Vials of thick liquid fed through a tube that jabbed into his forearm, forcing sedation. stinging incense that curled in the cold air, swirling around flickering lumens. Faint, distant screams echoing from other sections of the ship. He saw ranks of prisoners tested in similar fashion. Some collapsed mid-process, while others endured relentless prodding by hooded tech adepts and silent watchers. Though he tried to resist, tried to push away the sedation, it all ended the same. Darkness. When next he awoke, back in his cramped cell, he felt bone-weary, bruised from head to toe. His throat burned with dryness, his lips chapped from lack of water. A meager ration lay at his feet, a half bowl of bland, nutrient paste. He forced it down with trembling fingers, aware that he must maintain strength if he was to survive. The entire time, that dreadful emptiness lingered, a background static inside his mind. He was cut off from something fundamental, though he hadn't realized he'd possessed it in the first place. It was only when it was gone that its absence ached so fiercely. Time ceased to have meaning. No day or night. Only the thrumming hum of the ship's engines, the muffled cries of distant inmates, and the occasional pounding of boots in the corridor. At length, perhaps days, perhaps weeks, Luther was led through a labyrinth of steel passageways, guided by two black-armored troopers, and behind them, a single sister of silence. He dared not even glance back at her, for fear that her aura would unravel his mind entirely. They emerged into what appeared to be a block of holding pens, each cell separated by thick plasteel walls. Dozens of prisoners lined the corridor, heads bowed or pressed against the bars. A stench of waste hung in the stagnant air. Luther was pushed into a smaller cell, unchained from the shackles that pinned him, and forced into a corner. His muzzle was unlocked just enough that he could move his jaw slightly, though it remained impossible to speak in any comprehensible way. "Sit," snapped one of the troopers. He complied. The sister entered behind them, and the troopers stiffened to attention. She moved closer. In the gloom, Luther saw the faint reflection of harsh light on her breastplate. Her face, partially visible beneath a half visor, revealed a hardened countenance. Auburn hair, cropped short, framed pale skin, etched with scars. She lifted a silver rod about the length of her forearm. Slowly, she brought its tip near Luther's temple. Her eyes narrowed. Though she made no sound, something in her posture suggested unwavering intensity. Luther's body seized. A pulse of raw pain shot through his skull, setting his teeth on edge. A hiss escaped him. His vision swam, and he felt the collar around his neck spark. Another wave of nausea gripped him. What is she doing? He glimpsed runic inscriptions across the rod's surface, wards or circuitry that glowed with pale green lines. The sister was scanning him for deeper psychic traits. The device bit into his consciousness, rummaging for something intangible. She found something. Her posture shifted fractionally. Luther could not interpret her silent reaction. Then she turned away, leaving the cell. The troopers wasted no time, hauling him back to his feet. One replaced the muzzle's lock, though not as tightly. "That's enough for now," muttered the trooper. "Back to your hole." As they led him away, Luther felt a flicker of disquiet in the pit of his stomach. Why are they scanning me over and over? What do they want? Somewhere behind him, the sister watched in silence, unreadable as stone. That same day, though it was impossible to measure time precisely, Luther was thrown into a communal yard, ringed by armed guards on raised gantries. The floor was scuffed metal, strewn with debris and the stench of sweat. Around him, maybe 40 or 50 prisoners stood about in varying states of exhaustion, clad in rags and collars. Luther recognized only a few from the mustering bay. The tension was palpable. Some cowered in corners, arms around their knees, while others paced in sullen rage, muttering curses behind half-locked muzzles. He'd barely stepped forward when a man with wild eyes rushed at him, raising a makeshift shiv carved from a scrap of plasteel. Luther stumbled back, narrowly avoiding a slash that would have opened his abdomen. "Witch! You're all witches!" the man shouted, spittle flying. He brandished the blade again, his cracked lips curled in a manic grin. Luther's heart hammered. He had nowhere to run. The guards above watched with detached indifference. This scuffle was evidently no concern of theirs. The man lunged again. Luther raised his forearm, catching the blade across his bracer-like collar cuff. Sparks flew as the improvised weapon glanced off the metal. Pain shot through his arm, but he kept his feet. I'm no witch," he rasped, though the muzzle muffled his words to a slur. Fear gave him adrenaline, enough to jab his elbow into the attacker's ribs. The man stumbled, and Luther kicked the shiv away. A guard above raised a shock maul and triggered an arc of electricity that coursed through the grated floor. Both Luther and the attacker cried out, seizing as the voltage shocked them into submission. "Enough," came a stern voice from above. The electricity ceased. Luther and the man collapsed, panting heavily. Other prisoners retreated to the corners. Moments later, an interior door hissed open. A single Sister of Silence entered the yard with measured steps, flanked by a trooper on either side. The troopers aimed their weapons at the attacker first, then Luther. The sister inclined her head, acknowledging the prisoner with the wild eyes. She approached him with a methodical calm. He tried to scuttle away, but there was no escape. Guards pinned him in place. In eerie silence, she unsheathed a short blade. The man babbled incoherent pleas, face twisted with terror. Then, with one swift motion, the sister drew the blade across his throat. Blood splattered across the deck. Gasps rose from the crowd. No words, no condemnation. Only a silent execution for a man who had assaulted a fellow prisoner. Luther was too stunned to move, every nerve shaking. This was the Imperium's justice, swift and pitiless. The sister turned toward him, blade dripping red. Luther expected a similar fate. He tried to scramble back, but a guard pressed a shock maul to his ribs, forcing him to remain still. She stared at him with those cold, unreadable eyes. He expected the blade to descend on him next. Instead, after a heartbeat, she slowly sheathed it. She gave a curt nod to the troopers, who lowered their weapons. Luther's entire body trembled. The sister left without a backward glance, leaving the guards to drag away the corpse. From that moment on, Luther understood that life here was measured only in compliance. The sisters were merciless. The guards were brutal. The ship offered no solace, only the promise of final judgment. Still, he survived. Day by day, he found ways to avoid conflict, to keep his head low, to obey. A spark of naive hope told him that perhaps, if he did what they asked, the Emperor would spare him. He had yet to learn the grim truth. There was no true mercy on a black ship. Sister Audra traversed the gloom-wreathed corridors of the mid-deck, her footsteps a silent echo in the hush of her own making. She had walked these passages many times, though seldom had she felt so restless. The emptiness that emanated from her pariah gene was her constant companion, and it gave her a certain measure of detachment. Yet there were times, rare though they were, when she felt the faintest flicker of something like disquiet. She paused at a bulkhead that led to the observation deck. She pressed the rune to open it, and a gust of processed air sighed against her face. Within, a wide plasteel window revealed the swirling miasma of warp space beyond the Geller field. Ever-shifting lights warred with fathomless darkness, a silent fury that bled color into the void. Another sister stood there, clad in the same gilded armor, arms folded. At Audra's approach, they exchanged no words. None were needed. Instead, they communicated in a series of precise gestures, a form of battle sign unique to the Sisters of Silence. "Any sign of the disturbance?" Audra signed. The other sister, who bore the name Sothra, inclined her head. "Minor flux echoes near the detainee blocks. Preliminary scans indicate it originates from multiple psykers, untrained. Possibly spontaneous illusions." Audra's lips pressed into a thin line. Her vow of silence forbade her from speech, but her mind echoed with questions. "Have any of them manifested clear threat-level phenomena?" Sothra shook her head. "No, but watchful presence is mandated." Audra nodded. She turned her gaze back to the warp-streaked window. Her reflection glinted in the glass. An austere face with sharp angles, hair cropped short. A scar traced her right temple, a reminder of a confrontation with a possessed psyker a lifetime ago. Even now, her scalp itched faintly when she recalled that day. Her mind flicked to a name from one of the rosters she'd personally reviewed, Luther Hale. He was not a high-level threat, but something about his readings gave Audra pause. She couldn't place it, merely an instinct from years of training in psyker identification. His scan had shown moderate potential, but there was a certain anomaly, as if a deeper layer of psychic presence slept behind a wall of ignorance. Audra dismissed the thought. He was not the first perplexing case she had encountered. If the Emperor demanded a cull, then culling it would be. If Hale manifested a threat, she would snuff it out without hesitation. She turned to Sothra and made another quick sign. "We ensure compliance. The tithe must proceed." With that, the two parted. Audra moved through the labyrinth of the Black Ship, occasionally pausing to observe a guard station or prisoner block. Most inmates shrank back as soon as they felt her approach. Well before they actually saw her, that intangible sense of a psychic vacuum terrified them. She had been trained to see psykers as potential time bombs, corruptible by demons, tainted by the Imperium. It was her duty to watch them, to subdue them if they threatened the Emperor's realm. The presence of hundreds, if not thousands, of psykers aboard was a necessary evil for the Imperium's survival. The majority would die, fuel for the Golden Throne, or fodder for the astropaths. Audra felt no sorrow for them. A sister of silence could ill afford pity. She carried no illusions that her path was easy. She had chosen this vow, recruited as a child, tested, and found to be a blank. The Emperor's chosen blade against the warp. Yet as she stopped outside a sealed cell, glancing through the narrow viewport, she beheld Luther Hale, a man leaning against the wall, half awake, chest heaving with shallow breaths. Something in her chest tightened. A stray memory from her earliest days, a time she could barely recall. Someone with the same dusty brown hair, the same shaped eyes. A child's memory, fleeting. She shook it off. Sentiment is weakness. She turned and continued down the corridor. Time grew distorted for Luther. He couldn't tell how many weeks had passed. Sleep came in snatches, haunted by vivid nightmares of swirling darkness and an all-consuming hush. He would jolt awake to find himself drenched in sweat, heart hammering. At intervals, random bursts of psychic agony racked the corridors, like a ripple in the air that set all prisoners howling. Luther would press himself to the cell floor, eyes screwed shut, until it passed. The guards didn't bother explaining. Sometimes prisoners vanished from their cells overnight, never to return. Rumors scuttled through the captive populace. Some were culled for being too weak. Others suffered meltdown and had to be spaced from the airlocks. The luckiest were forcibly enlisted as sanctioned psykers, or so the rumors claimed. No one knew the truth for certain. Luther managed to cling to a sliver of composure by focusing on basic tasks, eating, sleeping when he could, not drawing the guards' attention. If a question formed, he repressed it. If a conversation with a fellow prisoner beckoned, he reminded himself of the savage executions that followed any breach of silence. Yet the nightmares persisted. In them, he drifted alone in a vast empty sea, hearing the keening of lost souls. Something monstrous in the depths called his name, beckoning him to open himself to the warp. One such nightmare drove him to near madness. He saw a great eye, wreathed in purple fire, staring through the hull of the ship. Its gaze bored into his mind. He awoke gasping for breath, hair plastered to his forehead. I am losing my mind. On the opposite side of the prison decks, Sister Audra also felt subtle shifts in the warp, though she perceived them differently, like a vacuum detecting the changes in pressure. Being a null, she could not sense the warp as a psyker might, but she could measure the fluctuation in those around her. The robed adepts reported surges in chaotic resonance, and the Sisterhood recognized the potential for a riot or a warp breach. Audra joined a patrol sweeping the lower decks, ensuring that sedative feeds and null field emitters remained intact. Where necessary, they doubled the guard. The troopers braced for possible insurrection among the inmates. In the gloom of sub-level 19, a klaxon suddenly blared. Audra sprinted along the corridor, leading two sister novices. Wisps of black smoke coiled from a rent in the bulkhead. Flickering lights revealed a scene of carnage. Two guards dead, limbs twisted at impossible angles, eyes seared out of their sockets. A prisoner stood in the corridor, shackles broken, a ragged welter of scars across his chest. Pale energy flickered around his trembling fingers. "Stay back," a guard shouted from behind a sealed barrier. The psyker, his mind half devoured by fear, unleashed a wave of telekinetic force. The corridor panels buckled, sparks rained down. The sister novices stumbled, reeling under the push of warp energies. But Audra's blank aura cut through that wave like a blade. She advanced with silent determination. The psyker's eyes bulged, his power fizzling in confusion. He tried again, screaming, but with each step Audra took, the intangible presence of her null aura negated his witchery. He lashed out physically, swinging a chunk of twisted metal. Audra parried with her short blade, severing his wrist in one fluid stroke. With her follow-up, she drove the blade through his throat. He collapsed, gurgling blood. The novices secured the corridor. Audra signaled to the guards behind the barrier to move in. Satisfied that the threat was contained, she gazed at the dead psyker, another poor soul lost to the warp's madness. She felt no pity. This incident, while not a large-scale riot, was a symptom. The further they drifted into the warp, the stronger the precarious tension became. The cargo, thousands of untrained, frightened psykers, risked meltdown, and among them, someone, or something, was fueling that meltdown further. Luther jerked awake, a stabbing headache pulsing behind his eyes. Another nightmare, another phantom voice chanting from the darkness of his skull. He tried to sit up, but realized he wasn't in his cell. Dim red lights flickered overhead. He heard the persistent beep of medical monitors. He was strapped to a med slab, thick restraints at his wrists, ankles, and across his chest. Near him, robed figures milled about, adjusting instruments that hummed with arcane energies. The air reeked of antiseptic and burning incense. He felt a wave of panic. A black-armored trooper stepped into his line of sight, helmet visor down. "Subject number 11635 awake," The trooper said to no one in particular. "Proceed." "Proceed," answered a rasping voice. A tall adept approached, wearing a hood embroidered with the sigils of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. The adept's gaunt face loomed over Luther, watery eyes flickering with mild curiosity. He lifted a syringe full of milky fluid. Luther tried to speak. "Please." The muzzle had been removed, but the dryness in his throat made his voice raspy. The adept ignored him, inserting the syringe into an IV line in Luther's arm. A cold burn spread through his veins. Darkness folded around his senses again, yet he did not lose consciousness entirely. Instead, he drifted in a half-lucid realm. He heard murmured incantations, felt tugs at his mind. The presence of a Sister of Silence hovered near, her aura constricting his thoughts. Images flashed in the swirl of sedation. A memory of his childhood farm, the day the crops were ruined by a dust storm. His mother's gentle face, grim with worry. A fleeting image of a younger girl with green eyes who left the farm at a young age. His father's funeral, the hush of the Emperor's shrine. Somehow these memories bled into the present. He felt intangible hands rummaging through them, as though searching for a hidden secret. Pain flared at his temples. Then came voices, not external, but within his own mind. "Open your soul to us." He gasped, struggling to form coherent resistance. But the sedation and the sister's null field battered him from opposite sides. He was trapped, pinned between the warp-laced interrogation and the vacuum of the sister's presence. He glimpsed an adept's face leaning over him once more. Then a spasm of raw agony lit up his nerves. A hiss escaped his lips as something pried at his consciousness. He felt a presence coiling in the dark corners of his mind, a presence not his own, a single eye wreathed in purple flame. Fear consumed him. He wanted to scream, but only managed a ragged moan. Then everything went black. Luther awoke on the cold floor of his cell. Bile clung to his tongue. He had no idea how long he'd been out. Hours, days. His body shook with aftershocks of the psycho-indoctrination test. He curled into a fetal position, retching. Had they planted something in his mind? Or had they discovered something lurking there? The cell door hissed open. A heavy-set trooper strode in, seizing Luther's collar. "On your feet, scum." Weakly, Luther complied. The trooper hauled him down the corridor, where another Sister of Silence waited. Helmetless, auburn hair cropped short, her face marked by a faint scar near the temple. She studied Luther with an unsettling intensity. He recognized her from the yard. She'd executed that man who attacked him. She'd also carried that scanning rod. Her presence exuded the same suffocating emptiness. She motioned for the trooper to unshackle Luther's wrists, though the collar remained. Then she simply stared at him, arms folded. He trembled, unsure if he was expected to speak. The muzzle was still gone, so in theory he could. But would that earn him a beating or worse? A subtle tilt of her head. "Speak," her posture seemed to say. He swallowed, summoning the nerve to form words. Why? Why are you doing this? I'm not a threat. I swear by the Emperor." That statement alone nearly caused him to sob. Once, he had invoked the Emperor's name with reverence. Now, it felt like a desperate plea, an empty hope. She did not answer, for she could not. Instead, she raised the silver scanning rod again. A needle of pain lanced Luther's skull. He clenched his teeth, forcing down a scream. The sister paused, regarding the rod's readout. Then she stepped closer, eyes narrowed. With the tip of a gloved finger, she brushed aside the hair at his temple, revealing a faint birthmark. Her expression hardened. She replaced the rod at her belt. "Do your duty," her stance declared. She nodded at the trooper, who forced Luther's arms behind his back and clamped shackles on again. They led him away. As she walked in silence behind him, Luther sensed, for the briefest moment, a tremor in her aura, a flicker of hesitation maybe. He could not be sure. The journey stretched on. The Black Ship, fully immersed in warp travel, endured the daily threat of malfunctions, warp storms, or demonic intrusion. The Geller field was strong, but so was the combined psychic presence of thousands of captives. One dreadful cycle, everything went wrong. It began with power fluctuations in the lower decks, followed by surging feedback in the null field generators. Shuddering tremors rocked the entire vessel. Lights sputtered. Bulkhead alarms wailed. Sister Audra responded immediately, joining a squad of sisters and troopers racing to contain the crisis. Inmates pressed themselves against cell doors, howling in terror as the dampeners faltered. Freed from the oppressive null fields, if only partially, their nascent psychic senses tore open. Some wept, others cackled with mania, still others convulsed as the raw warp battered them. Audra led the charge into an observation hub. The lights flickered, revealing a swirl of shadowy tendrils coalescing in the corners. Demonic incursion, her instincts screamed. She signaled to the novices, who hurled psych-out grenades. The grenades detonated with a burst of anti-psyker energy, tearing ephemeral shapes from the air. Screeches echoed in the warp, vanishing as quickly as they came. Yet the chaos spread. Throughout the hold, inmates broke free of their weakened shackles, minds fraying under the warp's assault. Bloodshed erupted. Mutations flared across some psykers, twisting limbs and distorting features. In the midst of the carnage, Luther cowered in a corridor, unshackled by the confusion. A guard lay dead nearby, half his torso melted by warp-borne flame. Luther stared at his own trembling hands. He felt the roiling storm in his mind, an echo of that monstrous presence from his nightmares. A single eye burned in his thoughts, urging him to let go, to unleash. "No," he shouted, clawing at his hair. He stumbled away, nearly slipping in the guard's blood. He had no desire to harm anyone. He only wanted this nightmare to end. A side door burst open. A monstrous figure, once a man, loped out on elongated limbs, face contorted into a half-demonic visage. A wave of crackling warp energy frothed around it. Luther gasped, backing away. The creature's eyes lit upon him, and it let out a guttural snarl, raising a taloned hand. Before it could strike, Sister Audra appeared at the corridor entrance. Her blade flashed. The creature reeled back, shrieking. She advanced, her null aura collapsing its warp-borne strength. With ruthless efficiency, she severed its arm, then drove her blade through its chest. Black ichor sprayed the deck. The abomination sank, dissolving into a puddle of rancid sludge. Audra turned to Luther, who quaked in fear. The entire corridor shook as the ship's systems groaned. She beckoned him forward as the klaxon wailed. He hesitated. Another wave of warp energy crashed overhead, blowing out illuminator panel. Shards of glass rained down. Luther cried out, covering his head. Audra moved swiftly, grabbed Luther by the collar and dragged him from the corridor. They half ran, half stumbled toward a more secure block. Her aura battered his senses, keeping the warp's voice at bay. They reached a sealed bulkhead. She tapped a code into a panel, but the power flickered. She tried a manual override, forcing the mechanism with augmented strength. The door ground open enough for them to slip inside. Beyond lay a smaller guard station, deserted, but for better lighting and functional security systems. Audra released Luther, and he collapsed against the wall, panting. For a moment she regarded him, disheveled, eyes wild. She raised a hand, palm out, motioning him to remain calm. The ship shuddered. A distant explosion rocked the hull. Then, as if by some miracle, the alarms began to stabilize. The lights flickered, brightened, and the klaxon grew less urgent. Through the overhead vox, a monotone voice announced, "Reinforcement of Geller field complete. Main power returning. Security teams to station." Audra exhaled through her nose, pulling herself upright. She turned to Luther again. He stared at her, swallowing thickly. Suddenly, the door behind them hissed open, revealing more troopers. They trained their weapons on Luther. Audra waved them down. The crisis had abated for now, but the repercussions were grave. Over the next hours, or days, the crew fought to restore full control. Scores of prisoners lay dead. Others were put down brutally. Those who manifested warp taint were executed on the spot. The Sisterhood patrolled every level, ensuring no demonic residue remained. Eventually, an uneasy calm returned. The voyage continued through the warp toward Terra. Within his cell once again, Luther grappled with the knowledge that the warp was no distant myth. It was inside him. He'd nearly been consumed by it. The sister had saved him for reasons unknown. Why did she spare me? He reflected on the fleeting glimmer he saw in her eyes. Something akin to recognition. The memory of a childhood face he could barely recall. Was it possible that he had known her once? The idea seemed absurd, yet it lingered in his thoughts, driving him to the brink of confusion. Though the worst of the crisis had passed, the Imperium's protocols demanded thorough investigations. The surviving prisoners were separated into more stringent containment. The Telepathica adepts resumed testing. Luther was subjected to a final round of agonizing scans, strapped to a psycho-reactive harness that measured his warp potential. The Sister of Silence, Audra, observed from behind a blast shield. She was joined by a stooped adept who monitored flickering readouts. "Reading stable," the adept commented. "This one exhibits moderate potential, but no direct sign of demonic taint. Residual trauma from the incursion event, but manageable." Audra gave a curt nod, her face expressionless. The adept peered at her. "Shall I mark him for the general cull?" Luther's heart hammered at the question. He fought the sedation that weighed down his limbs, desperate to speak. Audra paused. Then she shook her head. She lifted a data slate, tapped a brief note. The adept read it, eyebrows arching in mild surprise. "I see," the adept muttered. "Sanctioning candidate, you say? Very well. We shall place him in the potential group for further screening once we reach Terra. The final decision rests with the higher authorities, of course." She nodded again. Luther stared through the tinted visor, trying to meet her gaze. His chest burned with relief, confusion, and an emotion he couldn't name. General Cull. Was she sparing him from immediate death? But to what end? The final leg of the journey was a tense calm. Prisoners who were not executed or lost to the madness were systematically drained of hope, living as ghosts in shackles. Occasionally, Luther glimpsed the sister passing by. She offered no direct acknowledgement, yet he sensed a subtle, protective watchfulness. She always seemed near whenever guards manhandled him too violently, or if other inmates threatened him. In rare moments, Luther dared to recall half-formed childhood memories. A sister, maybe. A sibling who'd vanished. The official record said she died of a fever, but his mother once whispered that the child was taken for something greater. Could that be her? The notion was terrifying, yet strangely comforting. If so, why did she not reveal it? He had no answer. At last, the moment arrived. The ship dropped out of warp near Terra. The transition hammered the vessel with gravitational whiplash, but the Geller field held. Through the battered portholes, Luther saw the faint glow of the Emperor's throne world. His pulse raced. All his life, Terra had been a distant legend, a shining seat of humanity. Now it loomed before him, like a funeral pyre. With the Black Ship secured in orbit around the throne world, a new wave of administrative personnel boarded to process the cargo. Thousands of psykers were corralled into lines, each awaiting their final verdict. To be sanctioned, to be soul-bound to the Emperor as an astropath, or to be fed to the Golden Throne. Luther shuffled forward in a massive hangar bay, flanked by armed troopers on all sides. The air stank of ozone and sweat. Nervous prayers escaped some lips, muffled sobs from others. His turn approached. He expected to see a senior adept or perhaps an inquisitor behind a dais of humming machines. Instead, a robed official merely scanned his caller ID, then motioned him on. "Potential sanction candidate, proceed to holding pen D," the official droned. A trooper nudged Luther with a shock prod. He stumbled forward, passing a hulking servitor that stared blankly. Up ahead, pen D was a chain-link enclosure separated from the rest of the groups. As he moved, Luther caught sight of Sister Audra standing beyond the dais, half hidden in the swirl of robed staff. Their eyes met. She tilted her head. For a moment he thought she might step forward, but she stayed among the silent ranks of her order. A swirling rush of conflicting emotions overwhelmed him. He wanted to cry out, demand the truth, but the muzzle had been locked back on him for the final processing. His voice was lost. He entered Pen D, enclosed with perhaps a dozen other cowed psykers. The gate clanged shut. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, the line began moving again. Each prisoner was herded onto a cargo platform, escorted by black armored troopers. One step at a time, Luther's group ascended. Suddenly, a commotion broke out to the left. An older woman in tatters lunged for a trooper's sidearm, shrieking about not wanting to die. A scuffle ensued. The troopers shot her dead, no hesitation. Amid the chaos, the muzzle of Luther's neighbor jostled free, and he let out a panicked cry. "We're all doomed! You don't understand!" A guard struck him with a shock maul. The man collapsed, convulsing. A hush fell. Luther forced himself not to react. The cargo platform rose, rattling up a grav lift shaft. Pale overhead lights illuminated a short, wide corridor, leading to an imposing set of bronze doors, carved with the Imperial Aquila. Beyond was the gateway to the final halls of judgment. Luther and the others were marched forward. A sense of resignation clutched his heart. They halted at a checkpoint. Tech adepts scanned each prisoner. One of them read Luther's ID. A frown flickered across the adept's features. "I see. Sister Audra's recommendation," the adept murmured. Then to a trooper, "He goes left." The trooper shoved Luther down a side passage. The rest of the group continued straight. A swirl of dread and relief warred in Luther's gut. He had no idea if left was better or worse. The corridor stretched on, labyrinthine. Moments later, Sister Audra appeared at the far end, waiting. She gestured for the troopers to hand Luther over. They complied, stepping aside with a salute. Now alone in the corridor with Audra, Luther's mind spun. He tried to speak, but the muzzle locked his voice away. She reached up and unlatched it, letting it drop to the floor. He gasped with relief, rubbing his chafed jaw. "Thank you," he whispered. She looked at him steadily. No words. Then, with careful deliberation, she removed her own helmet, letting her short auburn hair show plainly. She touched the scar near her temple as if acknowledging a painful memory. In the echoing silence, she made a complex series of hand signs. He understood none of it. Desperate, he stammered. "Are you my sister? Did you come from... My mother always said..." She held up a hand to stop him. Then, with slow, deliberate motions, she undid a thin chain around her neck. She pressed a small metal token into his palm. He glanced down. The token was old, etched with a faded name, A-L-I. The rest of the letters were worn away. His breath caught. As a child, he remembered someone, a sibling, named Aliana or Alira. The details were fuzzy, like something locked them away. He looked up, tears welling. "It is you." Before he could speak again, heavy footsteps approached. A tall, robed figure with mechanical augmentations emerged from a side door, flanked by two silent novices. The figure's voice echoed from a Vox grill. "Sister Audra, step aside. The next stage awaits." Audra turned, her expression shuddering. She replaced her helmet, slipping back into the role of a silent warden. The robed figure gestured for Luther to follow. Audra did not look at him again, and then moved away with the novices. Luther felt hollow. So many questions battered his mind. The robed figure led him into a small antechamber. Inside, a multi-limbed machine bristling with needles and cables hummed ominously. The figure seized Luther's arm, attaching an IV line. "You have been singled out for specialized testing under the authority of the Sisters of Silence," the augmented adept droned. "If you pass, you may be sanctioned for the Emperor's service. If you fail..." They did not finish the sentence. Luther swallowed. He looked to the dark corridor where Audra had vanished. Then he inhaled, calling upon whatever scraps of courage remained. The machine hissed, pumping something into his veins. Agony rippled through him. His vision swam. In that final moment before unconsciousness claimed him, he clutched the metal token she had given him, a solitary anchor in an ocean of dread. Months later, though the concept of time meant nothing in the Emperor's labyrinth, an emaciated, hollow-eyed figure was loaded onto a sub-transporter bound for a deeper complex in Terra's catacombs. A half-dozen others joined him, similarly wasted by ritual testing. He had survived the initial culls, but was slated for final judgment. The brand on his temple read, "Sanctioning Candidate 11635. Somewhere far above, the Sister of Silence who had spared him took her next assignment, the Black Ship readied for departure once more. She walked the silent halls with stoic resolve, her vow binding her to never reveal the fleeting moment of recognition she had shared with one condemned psyker. Later, as Luther was processed deeper into the Adeptus Astra Telepathica's stronghold, the tech adepts discovered a curious anomaly in his screening logs. A faint psychic echo was recorded, one that didn't align with his middling potential. It hinted at a hidden presence, a seed of something far greater. The data carried Sister Audra's personal mark, as though she'd attempted to highlight it before being overridden by standard protocol. For reasons no one would discuss, the data was quietly purged from official records. Some adept had scrawled a single note in the margins: potential anomaly, psychic twin, Sister Jean. No further mention existed. Officially, Luther Hale was just another minor psyker, unremarkable, fated to be trained or expended. The Sister of Silence returned to her duties, burying the memory beneath the stoic demands of her vow. But in the labyrinthine bureaucracy of terror, rumors sometimes spread. Whispers told of a man who clung to a token passed from a silent woman. Some believed it was mere happenstance. Others wondered if the sister had recognized an unspoken bond, something that might have changed his destiny, had it been allowed to flourish. The truth remained buried in the hush of the sister's vow, and so, In the grimdark labyrinth of the Imperium, Luther Hale's fate would become a quiet footnote, overshadowed by a million tragedies and horrors that unfold each day. Yet for those who care to dig beneath official logs and sealed archives, there lingers a tantalizing mystery, an impossible sibling bond between a null maiden and an untrained psyker, separated by duty and zeal. If you listen closely enough, you can almost hear the echoes of that bond thrumming through the vaulted halls of terror, begging the question, what if? And that question remains, waiting for the Emperor's light, or the warp's darkness, to cast its final judgment. In the hush that follows Luther's final disappearance into terror's catacombs, we can't help but wonder, did the sister do right by sparing him? Or did she condemn him to a fate worse than death? If he truly held some hidden potential, was it the Emperor's will that it be unleashed or suppressed? Maybe it was the Emperor's light that ensured these two cross paths again, or did something else pluck the strings of destiny? Have your say. In a galaxy as vast and perilous as the Imperium, even the smallest shred of unanswered truth can become a beacon or a curse. Share your thoughts on the sister's choice, on Luther's uncertain doom, and on the secrets that lurk behind the Emperor's veil. The fate of one insignificant psyker may be trivial to the colossus that is the Imperium, but to those who look deeper, every ripple in the warp can herald a new dawn or an endless night. The echoes fade, shard walkers, yet the warp never truly falls silent. While the scribes consign Luther Hale's name to a forgotten ledger and the sister walks her vow-bound path, we remain, watchful, questioning, hungry for the next revelation. If this chronicle has stirred the embers of your curiosity, brandish your insight in the commentarium below. Your reflections feed the lumen of our archive and shape the tales yet untold. Should you wish to tithe a measure of your hard-earned coin to sustain these transmissions, remember, support is appreciated, not mandated. Find the link in the archives below if generosity moves you. Mark this datum in your cogitators. Subscribe to our order, strike the bell of notification, and let every new dispatch pierce the veil of your daily routine like a lance of holy light. Until then, Shardwalker, the Emperor protects.